Brilliant. Well, earlier we were singing about God always keeping his promises, weren't we? And although it was our kids' song, I'd asked Elaine and the musicians to include it this week for our benefit, with us grown-ups in mind, because the question we're considering today is, well, is that right? Does God always keep his promises? And the particular way we're coming at it is we're going to be thinking, does God keep his promises? Can God keep his promises in the face of his people's problems? So what did we sing? We sang how God said the sons of Abraham would be more than the grains of sand. But of course, if you know the story of Abraham, you'll remember that Sarah, Abraham's wife, struggled with infertility, and they didn't have a single child, let alone more than the grains of sand, despite 25 years of trying. Are God's promises really bigger than his people's suffering? We also sang about how the blood upon the door would keep the Israelites secure. Well, that blood may have protected them from the plague of the firstborn, but would it protect them from the anger of Pharaoh, when every firstborn son in Egypt, including his own, had died? Are God's promises bigger than his people's opponents? And then we also sang, didn't we, about how he gave us laws to be obeyed, but we broke every one he made. And when we ran from him, God said he'd take care of our sin. And again, the question is, well, really? Really? Are God's promises bigger than his people's fears and failings, bigger than their sins? And the emphatic answer we're going to see in Genesis 26 is a big fat yes. God's promises are so much bigger than his people's problems. They're bigger than his people's sufferings, bigger than their fears, bigger than their failures, bigger even than their opponents. In fact, as we're going to see, God's promises are so big. They're so big that even the folly of God's people's opponents cannot stop God blessing those opponents through his people, as he promised that he would do. And so this morning, as we work our way through Genesis 26, we're celebrating how God always keeps his promises, that his promises are so much bigger even than our problems. That's where we're going. Before we dive in, let me just say, if you were with us last week and were a bit confused as to where Jacob and Esau had disappeared to in Genesis 26, the reason they're not here is we've done a little bit of time traveling since last week. So although 26 obviously comes after 25, the events described in Genesis 26 happened before those in Genesis 25. That explains why Jacob and Esau aren't mentioned, and indeed that explains why Isaac was able to do such a good job of palming Rebekah off as his sister. If they'd have had twins in tow, that would have been somewhat trickier. Okay, that's by way of explanation why they're not here. Let's dive in. And here's the first way that God's promises are bigger than his people's problems, to encourage us this morning, that he won't let his people's suffering stop him blessing them. Have a look at verse 1 of Genesis 26, where we're told that there was a famine in the land beside the previous famine in Abraham's time. And so Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar. Famine has struck, and so Isaac and Rebekah go in search of something to eat. It's not the first time that's happened to God's people in Genesis. Our narrator reminds us that Abraham had to do this too. They'd faced food shortages as well. But I guess that's hardly surprising, given the people of Isaac's day didn't have access to modern agriculture and food storage. Maybe what's slightly more surprising is But as with Abraham also bumping into someone called Abimelech, so Isaac bumps into a king called Abimelech. But if I tell you that that name, Abimelech, means my father was king, well, suddenly it's not so much of a surprising name for a dynasty, even if it lacks a bit of imagination. Abimelech 1, Abimelech 2, Abimelech 3, and so on and so on. That's what we've got going on here. He was king of the Philistines in a place called Gerar. You can see on the map. And Isaac had been living in that place, Beer Lahai Roi. On my screen, it looks a lot greener. In fact, it wasn't as green as my screen looked. It's probably more like this. It was a dry, arid, mountainous place. And so moving to Gerar, this city near the coast where water and therefore food would have been much more plentiful, was a very wise thing to do. Of course, it would have been an even better bet to go down to Egypt, a land made fertile by the mighty Nile, which is as green and is as fertile as this photo makes out. But again, if you were with us when we were looking at Abraham, you'll know that that was outside God's land of promise. And although Abraham, Isaac's father, had made the mistake of going down to Egypt when famine struck in his day, he had walked off the map of God's blessing as he'd done so. God was determined that Isaac would not make the same mistake. And so he says, verse 2, the Lord appeared to Isaac and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you to live." And why is that? Well, it seems that God has got a purpose for Isaac here in Gerar. Verse 3, stay in this land and stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and will give them all these lands, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and did everything I required of him, keeping my commands, my decrees, and my instructions. To Isaac and Rebekah, these displaced people, these refugees, God promises a homeland. To this couple facing their own battles with infertility, in the last chapter, at the end of 25, we're told that they had to wait 20 years for the birth of Jacob and Esau. To them, in their own struggles, God promised descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. To people who had to enjoy the hospitality of Abimelech, this foreign ruler, they were dependent on him for their survival. God promises that all nations will be blessed through their offspring. See, God won't let his people's suffering stop him from blessing them. Now, brief aside, of course, with all that's going on in Israel and Palestine at the moment, and with all these talk of promises of land and inheritance, it'd be remiss of me not to mention the travesty that's going on in the Middle East at the moment. I'd love to talk to you more about that later if you've got questions about that, but I think the big line that the Bible draws for us is not to the physical Jerusalem at the moment, but to the new Jerusalem in the new creation. And so that's where all these promises to God's people are fulfilled. So this is seen not in the occupation of all of Israel by the Jewish people, but by the promise of heaven for all of God's people, all those who trust in the Lord Jesus Christ. But again, if you've got questions about that, come and chat to me later. I'd love to speak more about that if you have questions and concerns. But for now, let's just focus on the main thing God wants to say to us through Genesis 26, which is to reassure us that his people's suffering won't stop him blessing them. And unlike Abraham, Isaac gets this. Have a look at verse 6. So Isaac stayed in Gerar. He trusted God. He did something that's really, really hard to do. Because it's hard, isn't it, to believe that God can bless you in the midst of suffering. And maybe it's even harder to believe that God can bless you in the midst of suffering if that blessing doesn't include the relief of your suffering, as it didn't for Isaac and Rebekah. They were still displaced, still childless, still dependent on Abimelech. And yet Isaac, he invites us to follow in his footsteps of belief, to trust that it is possible, to celebrate the fact that God's promises are bigger than our problems. And again, it would be the testimony of many here today that when you do that, God does great things for us as he shows us how he works in and through our suffering. His promises are bigger than our problems. And that starts off really well for Isaac as he grasps and gets that God won't let his people's suffering stop them being blessed by him. But then, sadly, the wheels start to come off pretty rapidly. Verse 7. When the men of that place asked him about his wife, he said, "She is my sister." Because he was afraid to say, "She is my wife." He thought the men of this place might kill me on account of Rebekah because she is beautiful. Oh, Isaac, what are you doing? What are you doing? Well, as the wheels come off for Isaac, we see our second way in which God's promises are bigger than his people's problems, because he won't let his people's fears and failures stop him protecting them. Isaac, his fear has driven out his faith. He's lied about his wife, about their marriage. And it wasn't just a one-off slip. Beginning of verse 8, did you notice when Isaac had been there a long time? This wasn't just something he got wrong once. And so he's worried, he's fearful. His fear, it drives out his faith, and he can't believe that God can keep his promises. Remember, of course, that Jacob and Esau, as we've said earlier, they haven't been born at this point. And so there are no descendants to speak of, no people from whom they might become as numerous as the stars in the sky. And yet his fear, it drives out his faith. And he palms off Rebekah, the one through whom these promises will be realized, as his sister. And it goes on for a long time, but God wonderfully steps in to protect. Because how does verse 8 continue? When Isaac had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked down from a window and saw Isaac caressing his wife, Rebekah. So Abimelech summoned Isaac and said, "She is really your wife. Why did you say she is my sister?" Isaac, no doubt rather sheepishly, answered him, "Because I thought I might lose my life on account of her." Then Abimelech said, "What is this you have done to us? One of the men might have slept with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us." So Abimelech gave orders to all the people, "Anyone who harms this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." Isaac was fearful, his fears led to failure, and yet God acts to protect him. Because I wonder who ordained that Abimelech would be looking down out of his window, just as Isaac and Rebekah were enjoying a kiss and a cuddle. I wonder who, more than that, gave this pagan king a greater fear of God than Isaac seemed to have. I wonder who it was who put it on this king's heart to issue that decree. Anyone who harms this man or his wife shall surely be put to death, when that man who had been so deceitful was surely the one who deserved to face consequences. Who was behind the scenes protecting his people? Well, of course, it's the God of Genesis 26, the God who won't let his people's fears and failures stop him protecting them from the most serious consequences of their actions. He's not going to let his people be cut off from the biggest of the blessings he wants to bestow upon them. Now, just like saying God blesses his people through suffering, but that blessing doesn't necessarily involve the release of that suffering. So here, God protecting his people from the worst consequences of their action doesn't mean that there's no consequence of their sin, no consequences for Isaac to face. Did you notice he still had to face the ignominy of being rebuked by a foreign king? He still had to face up to the fact that Abimelech seemed to care more about his wife than he did. There were still consequences for his sin that Isaac needed to face, but the biggest consequence for Isaac not having his descendants as God's people, for us not being included among God's people. Well, those biggest of consequences is something that God protects his people from, even in the face of their fears and failings. That invitation for us to celebrate God's promises being bigger than his people's problems. Third, God won't let his people's opponents stop him providing for them. Let's pick things up at verse 12. Isaac planted crops in that land, and the same year reaped 100-fold, because the Lord blessed him. The man became rich, and his wealth continued to grow until he became very wealthy. He had so many flocks and herds and servants that the Philistines envied him. So all the wells that his father's servant had dug in the time of his father Abraham, the Philistines stopped up, filling them with earth. Then Abimelech said to Isaac, "Move away from us, you have become too powerful for us." So Isaac moved away from there and camped in the valley of Gerar, where he settled. Isaac reopened the wells that had been dug in the time of his father Abraham, when the Philistines had stopped up, which the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham died. And he gave them the same names his father had given them. Isaac's servants dug in the valley and discovered a well of fresh water there. But the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with those of Isaac and said, "The water is ours." So they named the well Esek, because they disputed with him. Then they dug another well, but they quarreled over that one also. So he named it Sitnah. It's like a sort of weird well-digging version of whack-a-mole, isn't it? They dig over here, and the Philistines fill it in. They dig over here, and the Philistines fill it in. Dig, fill, dig, fill, dig, fill, all across the valley of Gerar. But then, after what seems like an age, we read verse 22. He, Isaac, moved on from there and dug another well, and no one quarreled over it. He named it Rehoboth, saying, "Now the Lord has given us room, and we will flourish in the land." Finally, they settled on an undisputed spot, a source of water in that dry and barren land. And Isaac wastes no time, does he? Again, he gets this one right. He wastes no time in recognizing where this provision has come from. The Lord has given them room. The Lord has provided for them. God won't let his people's opponents, stop him providing for them. Now, once again, that provision, it doesn't mean life will be easy for them. They still faced opposition, didn't they? They still had to play well whack-a-mole here, there, and everywhere. But it doesn't stop God providing for his people's needs. Once again, we can celebrate God's promises being bigger than his people's problems. And then finally, we see what is perhaps the most astonishing way in which God's people are bigger than people's problems. When we see not his people's problems being met, but the opponents of his people having their problems being met. Because finally we see that God won't let the folly of his people's opponents stop him blessing them through his people. Remember back in verse 4, Isaac said that through your descendants, all nations will be blessed. Well, as we come to the end of Genesis 26, Abimelech and the Philistines, they get a sort of sneak preview of that promise coming about. Have a look, verse 26. Meanwhile, while Isaac is celebrating God's provision, Abimelech had come to him from Gerar with Hazua, his personal advisor, and Phicol, the commander of his forces. Isaac asked them, "Why have you come to me, since you're hostile to me, and sent me away?" And they answered, "We saw clearly the Lord was with you." So he said, "There ought to be a sworn agreement between us and you. Let us make a treaty with you, that you will do us no harm, just as we did not harm you, but always treated you well, and sent you away peacefully. And now you are blessed by the Lord." So Isaac then made a feast for them, and they ate and drank. Early the next morning, the men swore an oath to each other. Then Isaac sent them on their way, and they went away peacefully. What happens? Abimelech and the Philistine top brass, they realized that they'd been getting it all wrong. They come to their senses, they stop their policy of wrestling, and they recognize that God's hand is with Isaac and his family. They see God's with him, and so they don't want to be on the wrong side of him. So they ask Isaac to bless them by setting up the ancient Near East. I guess it's their version of NATO, isn't it? We won't harm you, you won't harm us, we'll help one another. It'll be all good. Even though Abimelech and the Philistines had opposed Isaac, had opposed the Lord, actually God gave them eyes to see that he, the Lord, was with Isaac. He was with his people. He didn't let the folly of those opponents stop him blessing them by this alliance. Now, again, for us, it's different. We don't see this sort of blessing in militaristic ways. But here's one way I think we can see it. We do see it. Imagine with me the non-Christian friend who gives you all sorts of grief for your faith, who mocks you for what you believe, but who you nevertheless keep being friends with, keep plugging along with them, and who in God's hand is converted. They come to know the Lord Jesus for themselves through your loving, patient witness. Imagine it, if that happened, what would be going on? Well, God wouldn't be letting their folly stop him blessing them through you. And if you're sat there thinking, well, that could never happen, let me remind what I said last week. That was me. I was the one who mocked the Christian friends I had at university, who gave them a really hard time, but they persevered. They kept on going. And the Lord used them to call me to himself through them. Because God's promises, they're bigger than people's problems. Here's our fourth reason to celebrate. He won't let the folly of his people's opponents stop him blessing them through his people. 4 big reasons to celebrate here in Genesis 26, 4 ways in which God's promises are bigger than people's problems. He won't let his people's suffering stop him blessing them. He won't let his people's fears and failures stop him protecting them. He won't let his people's opponents stop him providing for them. And he won't let the folly of his people's opponents stop him from blessing them through his people. We've seen it in the lives of Isaac and Rebekah. Perhaps you can start to imagine it in your own life, how those things have been true, could be true. But of course, we see it most fully, not in our lives, not in the lives of Isaac and Rebekah, but in the death of Jesus Christ. Because we know that God's promises are bigger than people's problems when we look to the cross. And why is that? Well, it's because on the cross, Jesus, the King of God's people, the representative of God's people, he suffered in the most terrible of ways. And what made it worse was that suffering, it came about because of the religious authorities, because of God's priests and the teachers of God's law. It came about because of their fear. They were fearful, weren't they, of the threat Jesus posed to their position and their power and their authority. And then there were the crowds in Jerusalem, another group of God's people, not standing for justice, not calling for Jesus' release, but instead pleading that the criminal Barabbas be freed in his place. Suffering of God's king, the fear and failure of his people. And then, of course, there was the opponents of God's people, the occupying Roman forces who were complicit in the crucifixion. It were their soldiers who drove in the nails. And yet through all that, through the suffering of the cross, through the fear and failure and opposition that led to it, God pours out his ultimate blessing on people. Because on the cross, he restores his people's innocence. They no longer stand before him guilty. He frees his people from the fear of the dark spiritual forces that are present in our world. Because they no longer have the power of death to hold over his people. At the cross, their shame is taken, and he restores them to a place of honor. Brings about his promises. And even though the nations, through the Romans, were involved in the opposition to God's king, to the representative of his people, of course, they're now included because, well, the death of Jesus, it throws the gates wide open, and all are welcome into God's people. And in Christ, God's promises are not just for the biological descendants of Abraham and Isaac, as we have here in Genesis 26, but for all those who believe God's promises, those promises that are so much bigger than his people's problems. Let me pause there. Let me give you just a moment to start to respond in your own heart to what we've been thinking about this morning. And then I'll lead us in a prayer, praising God for the bigness of his promises.